Welcome to the Apologetics Guy Show. It's the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible, and then helps you to better explain your faith with both courage and compassion. If we're just meeting, I'm Dr. Mikkel Del Rosario. I'm the host of this podcast. I'm also a professor of Bible and theology at the Moody Bible Institute. I want to welcome you to my independent show. Well, a lot of these tough questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible are coming out of a movement called the Deconstruction movement. And we have two deconstruction experts with us on the show today. First guest is Alisa Childers. She's the author of this book, The Deconstruction of Christianity. And I love the subtitle, What It Is, Why It's Destructive, and How to Respond. That's going to be kind of the outline of our show today. Welcome to the show, Alisa.
So great to be with you, Mikkel.
And I want to welcome the second guest as well, is Tim Barnett. He's the co-author of this book. He's also an apologist with Stand to Reason and the creator of the Red Pen Logic with Mr. B YouTube channel. Welcome, Tim.
It's good to be with you.
Well, let's just dive right into our conversation and talk about this phenomenon of deconstruction. We've heard this term a lot. If you're on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, we see this hashtag deconstruction, hashtag exvangelical. What is this phenomenon that we're seeing? Alisa, could you help us understand this?
Right. Well, in some sense, it's nothing new. We've always seen people walk away from the faith in times past. In fact, in our book, we trace it all the way back to the Garden of Eden with, the questioning of God's word and what God had said. And so, granted, we realize that this has been going on for a really long time, but there has been a more modern phenomenon is a really good word. In our book, we call it an explosion of people who are not just leaving the faith, but they are sort of rallying together and leaving the faith very loudly. They're very evangelistic in the sense that they're trying to bring people into their deconstruction movement. It's a large community that can be found online. In fact, the exvangelical hashtag, which often goes in conjunction with the deconstruction hashtag, has been used millions of times. And so it's something that is definitely new in the sense that it's more organized. In fact, I can't remember who it was, they said there's apostasy and then there's organized apostasy. And so what we see in the deconstruction movement is, for the most part, an organized apostasy. But I do want to just say that because of there being a lot of people writing about this word and commenting on this word, there is some disagreement about what the word even means. And I know we're going to get into some of that, but we just want to acknowledge that not everyone who uses the word deconstruction represents the movement and the phenomenon that we're talking about in our book.
I had my friend Sean McDowell on this podcast talking about his book, Set Adrift, which is also talking about the deconstruction movement. Also got to spend a day with John Marriott recently, and he told me, you can deconstruct your faith, the house of faith, all the way down to the studs, he says, as long as you keep the lordship of Jesus central as the foundation, because then you have something to rebuild on. How do you guys take a different approach to this idea of deconstruction than what they shared in the book?
Yeah, I've also read Sean's book, and Sean's a good friend. I think that Sean's book is different than our book in actually many ways. The first thing is, I think Sean's book is meant for a different audience. I think his book is meant to give to someone who is going through what they might call deconstruction, or actually what a lot of people just call doubting or questioning. And I actually think if you did kind of a find and replace of the word deconstruction or deconstructing in Sean's book and put doubting instead, I actually think that it would work. Where our book differs is that our audience is not primarily for the person who's deconstructing. It's actually meant for the person who is a loved one of someone who's going through deconstruction or is deconstructing. And by the word deconstruction, we mean something very different from Sean. Sean and Jonathan Marriott, they actually talk about good deconstruction and bad deconstruction, or healthy deconstruction and unhealthy deconstruction. I think they even use the word faithful deconstruction. We actually thought about defining and describing deconstruction that way early on in our research, But it came to a point where we were following the influencers of the deconstruction movement, and it was like, we've seen too much, okay, to actually go down that route. Because deconstruction isn't whatever you want it to be. It is something in particular. It's not a that, it's a how. It's a methodology. What is that methodology? Well, that methodology, and this is how we define the word in our book, is a postmodern process of rethinking your faith without requiring scripture as a standard. So there's two key elements in there. The first has to do with truth. The second has to do with authority. And what we found over and over again when it came to reading what the deconstructionists themselves are saying, and the people who are kind of leading the movement, the ones who have traction on TikTok and Instagram, primarily on social media. This is where this movement's really taking place. What we found was their process doesn't have objective truth as the highest goal. In fact, in many cases, they don't believe when it comes to religion, there is objective truth. And that's why it doesn't matter where you land. You can land in, progressive Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism or atheism. The deconstructionists themselves will say that the destination doesn't matter. That's because it's like ice cream, not like insulin, okay? If someone's a type 1 juvenile diabetic, insulin matters. But if it just comes to, well, what's my favorite flavor of ice cream? Obviously, some people like chocolate, other people like vanilla. Okay, so truth becomes more like ice cream, preferences, not insulin or objective reality. The second piece is the authority piece. What we found is the Bible is usually outright rejected in this space, okay? Sometimes it's, they'll go to it for some counsel as long as it agrees with my ideas. So I'm happy to quote Jesus when he says, love your enemy or love your neighbor. But when it comes to, him defining marriage as between a man and a woman, becoming one flesh for one lifetime in Matthew 19, or when it comes to Paul talking about arsenokoitai, homosexuality, or when it comes to Moses, then all of a sudden, my authority trumps the Bible's authority. So those are the two key elements. And what we found was it doesn't help to add adjectives like healthy, faithful, and good to deconstruction. It becomes an oxymoron because what we're saying is the real how process methodology of deconstruction isn't good, healthy, or faithful. So what we decided to do, our approach, you asked, what's the difference? We said, let's stop using deconstruction. Here's what it is. Let's do something different. So if you have doubts, you have questions, here's another process. It's a different process than deconstruction, and we're calling it reformation. Other people have called it disentangling your faith and so on, but it's a different process.
Yeah, so that's good to think about the language actually coming from postmodernism. When I was in the MA Apologetics program at Biola decades ago, I read the Postmodern Bible, I read Foucault and Derrida, and we never thought back in the day that these kind of things we thought were just like ivory tower philosophers philosophizing, that this would actually become mainstream and change the culture that we live in. And yet, here it is. And so, Alisa, it's too simplistic, you say, to say that everyone who says they're going through a deconstruction is a truth suppressor or a truth seeker. Unpack that for us so we can understand where people might be coming from when they use that term.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that question because I think it really is important if you have someone in your life who says, hey, I'm deconstructing my faith. Before you make any assumptions about what they mean by that word, you have to realize that it's like an accordion word that people are using to describe all sorts of different things. And so the best question would be, well, what does deconstruction mean? What does that mean to you? And for a lot of the younger generation, I found that word to them means, oh, I'm just doing some hard, questioning. I've got some doubts that I want to explore. And I think if that's the case, we should encourage them that's a good thing to do. It's good to press hard on our faith. It's good to ask the hard questions and engage our doubts. We don't want to suppress that stuff. But what I've tried to do is persuade them to not use the word deconstruction if they are truly seeking after truth. If the person is seeking for truth outside of themselves in objective reality, and they're willing to follow that truth where it leads, then I would encourage them to use a different word. But here's the problem in the deconstruction phenomenon. You mentioned Derrida. In our research, one of the things we discovered is that, these guys, Derrida, Foucault, these aren't just isolated to the 60s and some stuff that was going on back then. There is actually philosophers today who are taking their ideas and applying them to religion, calling it deconstruction, and informing the deconstruction movement. One of those is a guy named John Caputo, who wrote a book called What Would Jesus Deconstruct? And essentially, the case that Caputo is making is, in my view, it just looks a lot like progressive Christianity. It's the idea that, an idea never arrives. It never quite lands. It's always arriving. Therefore, it's kind of morphing and changing. And so he made all sorts of speculations about even what Jesus would teach today if he were incarnate on earth today. And if that's the mindset of the person who's in deconstruction, that they're looking for a new way or a different way, different from maybe what Jesus taught before, I think that's when we're in dangerous territory. And that is the primary manifestation of what we see in deconstruction. Now, granted, it can be very difficult to discern because there are a lot of people in the deconstruction movement who will say, I am seeking truth. I'm the one seeking truth. And you're trying to suppress truth by making me just agree with your preconceived answers. And I can certainly understand where someone like that might be coming from. But I think what needs to be realized is in the deconstruction hashtag and in the movement online, there is a large pushback against people who are older and wiser than you, tradition, things that have been sort of settled and decided. All of those things are now up for grabs again. And that's a very individualistic, almost postmodern mindset that we have found. So like what Tim said, the deconstruction that we see happening in our culture today it's very rare to find somebody who says, I'm just, searching for truth. And then they actually ever land on something that has been already established by a tradition or by orthodoxy, as we might call it. So it's a tangly beast to sort of unpack. That's why we really just would prefer people not use the word if they are just trying to maybe question the type of Christianity that they were given as a child. I think everybody should do that because we've all grown up with all sorts of different streams of Christianity, and we should, as part of becoming a mature believer, question those things and say, does this line up with Scripture? Does this line up with what the Christian faith actually is? And that was a process that I went through many years ago when my faith was really rocked by a progressive pastor. And I went through a years-long that I did call deconstruction back then. I don't call it that anymore now that I've researched deconstruction. But I did kind of what John Marriott was talking about. I busted everything down to the absolute studs and then rebuilt. And so my theology looks quite a bit different than it did growing up. But those core essentials of the Christian faith, what I discovered is that what my parents gave me, that we agree on what that is. And so there are a lot of areas where Christians can agree to disagree, but it's those core essentials, those established essentials that we can't agree to disagree about. And I think that's what the deconstruction movement calls into question. Just as a broad look at what they're doing, they're calling into question those kind of established essentials and those traditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you wrote about the good, the bad, and the ugly that unfortunately you saw while working in the music industry, specifically in a Christian context, when you were touring with Zoe Girl. And tell us a little bit about how that played into these kinds of questions in your life and how you got through that time in your life.
Right. Well, yeah, that is something that was a really interesting experience to get to travel for 7 years and just really get to sort of encounter and experience virtually every type of evangelicalism that is out there, or at least was out there back then. And everything from, one of the things I write about in the book is going to these big conventions where they would take you out on the sales floor, and there was just all of these booths and tables filled with what everybody called Jesus junk. And the Jesus junk was like the trinkets, the scripture mints and the stuffed animals and the jewelry and all of the things that sort of commodified Christianity. And So something like that. There was another experience I had with a big mega pastor. We were playing at a church, and the security team of like 10 guys that walked this mega pastor right by us, we were the only people there, and he didn't even acknowledge us until we like walk into his room. And I just remember thinking, that's weird. That's just weird that a pastor would behave that way when we're sitting there in the waiting room. And just the lack of graciousness and hospitality with that. There were other things where, there were a lot of unkind notes that we received on the bus where people were very judgmental about maybe the clothes we were wearing, or the way that that we talked about our faith, or that fact that we danced, in the beginning of Zoe Girl, it was the Christian Spice Girls sort of era 2000. So we did some dancing in the beginning. So there was a lot of like that kind of condescending, judgmental attitude. So by the time that touring was done, now granted, a lot of what set me up for my faith crisis is my own fault. Those things were in the background, and I definitely had criticisms and critiques for evangelical culture. But at the same time, I had become very, I would say, apathetic in my faith. I still loved Jesus, but I was really struggling with depression. I didn't do well in the touring life. And I really kind of wasn't really reading my Bible anymore. I was hardly praying by the end of that. And I wasn't connected to a local church. So I think all of those things created the perfect storm to propel me into this faith crisis. But so what happened was when my husband and I started attending this church, that we didn't realize at the time, many people in the church had already gone over to progressive Christianity, including the pastor. They just hadn't really advertised that yet. But they had a lot of those same critiques that I had. And I thought, I have found my people. Like they see some of this, what I would have called, corruption in the evangelical church. But what totally shocked me was that when I took part of this smaller class, how freely, willingly, and quickly the people in my class, including the pastor, were just chucking out doctrines like the resurrection, substitutionary atonement, the reliability and inerrancy of Scripture. I mean, these things were just tossed just as easily as criticizing a mega pastor for ignoring you on the way into the waiting room. And I'm thinking, okay, these are radically different categories. But it was really shocking to me just how quickly everyone else was just like, oh yeah, the Bible has been used as a weapon, and it does teach really immoral things. And so we can now and they wouldn't have said it this way, but essentially they were saying, we can now kind of be our own arbiters of truth, and we can pick what we like in the Bible and maybe get something out of parts of it. But we have to acknowledge that there are parts of it that are immoral, so we're going to chuck that. And I was just like, wait, what are we doing here? And so that was very shocking to me, just how quickly they were able to throw the baby. I mean, it's a proverbial term, but throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. Wow. It's a difficult thing when you go through it yourself, when you see your loved ones going through it, when pastors and people who are supposed to be representing Christ don't represent Christ very well to you. And, I think it's a special grace of God for when that kind of thing has happened in my life, that I was able to separate out very clearly who God was from who these people were. Because when I tell people things that have happened to me, they're like, we're glad you're still Christian,
Yes, right.
Because we see that kind of thing, unfortunately, and we're all works in progress, and may God have mercy on us. But to think about the difference between deconstructing your faith, you make this distinction in the book, deconstructing your faith versus deconstructing the faith. And so, somebody once wrote to me on X Twitter. I like to call it X Twitter because it's X Twitter in more ways than one.
Yeah, that's right.
Someone wrote, "Stay brown, bro." And I'm like, what? What on earth what is this coming from? And this guy was like, we have to deconstruct this white evangelical theology. And you wrote about that in the book. Tim, what are they talking about when they say something like that?
Well, yeah, this is fascinating. Before I answer that, I just want to make it clear that Alisa and I worked really hard in this book to make sure that we understood and people understood that there's a difference between acknowledging real crises that are out there that people go through and the deconstruction that can follow. And so we're not trivializing. I mean, there is real abuse. There's real hypocrisy. There are real things that happen to people. And man, we tried hard to understand where people were coming from. And our what we advocate for is when you go through that, because it's not in a matter of if, but when. Everybody goes through something. You don't have to take the route of deconstruction. The crisis can make you a good candidate for deconstruction, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to land in deconstruction. So I just want to make sure that was really clear. And we did. We worked really hard to make sure that point came across. I think that there is this movement right now that is happening where, because of the postmodern nature of truth that people have adopted, and the critical race and critical theories that are out there, that it has become commonplace now to refer to different theologies as toxic rather than false. So if you believe that when it comes to religion, when it comes to Christianity, that things can be objectively true or false, then what you do is you get your Bible out and you would kind of settle the issue. Okay, what is the appropriate understanding of the doctrine of submission, for, say, women? Or wives, I should say, versus husbands, or women in ministry. That's a controversy. What is the appropriate understanding of the doctrine of hell or original sin? And let's look at the merits. Well, now, because of the influence of postmodernism, as well as expressive individualism, we could talk about, there's some different philosophies that people don't know the names of, but they have been influenced. It's the water they're swimming in, okay? And they've been impacted this. Instead of saying that's not true, they'll say it's toxic. And what they mean is, I have assessed this using my own kind of moral compass, not necessarily an objective standard, but my own, to say that this is harmful or this is abusive. I don't like this. And so I'm going to condemn it. And so there's lots of doctrines that we see that have been just labeled as oppressive, and they get labeled as this is white evangelical, American evangelicalism or something, as if people in the evangelicals who are in Africa or China don't believe in the doctrine of hell, or they don't believe in the doctrine of, submission, or whatever doctrine you choose. Okay. I think that it just ends up with this kind of name calling. I'm going to label it this. And because on the oppressive chart, the white male evangelical is kind of, they're the most oppressive, and you go down the list, we can just dismiss it as oppressive based on the hierarchy. So now we're told to view the Bible through other theories, like queer theory, or a feminist theory, or a whatever theory. And that's supposed to come to a better theology. But even to talk about a better theology doesn't make sense on this view, because it's not better in terms of truth. It's better in terms of the hierarchy. So that's what I think is what's going on. And that's why if you hop on, hashtag deconstruction, hashtag exvangelical, you'll see a lot of the labeling of, okay, this is toxic, and this is toxic. And if you ask why, well, it's look at how it harms people or how it's been used to abuse people. Not the question of whether or not it's taught in Scripture, which is a totally different question. But of course, it presumes that there is such a thing as truth.
Yeah. Yeah, you use a great illustration in the book about the dangers of deconstruction, and you use this illustration of dissecting a frog. Help us understand the dangers of deconstruction using this illustration, Tim.
Well, when it comes to deconstructing a frog, and I used to be a science teacher, okay? So we would get the formaldehyde out, when I smell that, it's like, that takes me back to my days there. And it was really important when you're deconstructing, when you're dissecting a frog. And by the way, the reason this dissection thing came up is because Alisa, in her book, Another Gospel, when she defined the word deconstruction, she said it's like dissecting your beliefs. And what we were doing in our book is actually kind of challenging that original definition that she had stated. And the reason we did that was because when it comes to dissecting, you're dissecting something dead. Okay? Like, you're not going to hurt the frog when you take the heart out, when you go in there and cut out the liver and you do all. And what we said was, man, when you are deconstructing your faith, it's not dissecting something alive. You're dissecting something dead. You're dissecting something that's alive, which we call vivisection, okay? And so this is something that's an operation. And if you make the wrong incision, you can actually kill the animal you're working on, the frog or the pig or whatever. So this is why there's a warning in our book. Be careful. We're not scared. A lot of people are like, oh, these evangelicals are so scared of deconstruction. Like we're shaking our boots or something. And we say, no, we're not scared, but we are being realistic here. If you take the scalpel to your faith, you could kill your faith. And so you want to make sure you know what you're doing. And this actually opens up the question to all kinds of ideas, like man, who do you go to when you're questioning and you're doubting? If you go to the deconstruction coach and they see things in terms of deconstruction how we've just described it, it is no wonder that you end up leaving Orthodox Christianity or historic or biblical Christian, whatever you want to call it. It's no wonder. Because of the methodology they're using, you can kill your faith if you take that approach. And so that's kind of where we thought, yeah, it's not just about dissecting. It's more like vivisecting something alive. And so here's the warning. Be careful. Do this the right way, or there will be consequences. And one of those consequences, sadly, we see it over and over and over again. People go to the deconstruction coaches and they're deconstructed right out of their faith altogether.
Wow. Well, at the end of your book, you have a section on advice, and in the book, you have 4 steps to take. Talking now to people who have loved ones who are in this. Sometimes people are asking questions, looking for exits, you say, and then sometimes they're looking for answers. Well, probably somebody is on a spectrum in between those two, perhaps. What are some things that we can do to engage with them in a respectful way? Alisa, can you talk about those 4 steps?
Yeah, so we were thinking a lot about the advice chapter, because one of the things that I realized when I would give a presentation about deconstruction is I was kind of focusing on what it is. Here's what's happening. Here's what they're saying. Here's what these terms mean. And then at the end of my talks, people would be like, is there any hope? Like, how do we talk to people? And so I thought it was really important for us to be able to give some real practical advice. And so the one thing we talk a lot about in that chapter is that there is no 2 deconstruction stories that are the same. Everybody has a different story, and there's going to be different trigger points. There are people who have been through legitimate spiritual abuse and trauma in their spiritual environments. There are people who have witnessed a lot of hypocrisy. There are people who have been genuinely harmed by the churches that they've been in. And so it's really important to do triage. And so it's kind of like when there's an accident on the freeway and then people start flooding the ER, the doctors have to assess what's the most urgent need, and then they treat the most urgent need first. And so in this relationship, it's important to ask yourself some important questions like, what is your relationship to this person? Because the way you're going to navigate the deconstruction of your spouse is going to look a little different than how you're going to navigate, say, the deconstruction of your adult grown child who's already out of your house, or how you might navigate the deconstruction. If you're a college student, you might navigate your peer deconstructing. And so we try to address those different types of relationships. And so the first thing we say is you have to understand the nature of what they're going through. That's why we spent so much time in the book on the what, because it's so important to understand the mindset that first, you want to ask what they mean by deconstruction. But if they're telling you that they're deconstructing, there's a really good chance that they just mean doubt, because in the deconstruction movement, because doctrines are not assessed based on what is, what reflects the biblical teaching or what reflects objective truth. It's really more like, what do I feel is toxic or unsafe or harmful or oppressive? They already probably think you are a toxic or unsafe person. So you have to start with that knowledge and understand that this is a very fragile relationship dynamic, most likely. And if it is a very fragile relationship dynamic, the most urgent need might just simply be to stay in their life. And so what we advise Christians to do is that a lot of times our knee-jerk reaction as Christians can be to, invite Sarah out for a coffee date. And, from our discussions with deconstructionists and from studying the movement, Sarah doesn't want to go have coffee with you. She knows why you're inviting her to coffee, and she doesn't want to go to coffee with you. And so the best thing we can do if there's fragility in the relationship is just try to maintain relationship and try to stay in their life. Don't try to fix their theology right away. Don't go making a bunch of objective truth claims, because again, those objective truth claims, when you say things like, well, Jesus this and hell exists and all these things, what they're hearing is that, you're oppressing me more, you're causing me further trauma and further harm. So if you can establish that relationship, I think that's the most important thing to do in the beginning. But then if you can keep that relationship, then down the road, you might be able to interact a little more with the theology. And we suggest first do a lot of really active listening. Listen to what they're saying. Try to understand if there are wounds underneath, because that again there was a story. It was a women's conference that I was speaking at, and a woman was walking with one of her friends who was in deconstruction. When I asked this woman a few more questions about her friend had been sexually abused by a pastor. And she's like, but I don't know how to get her to believe the right things. And I told this woman, look, the first thing you need to do is cry with those who cry, comfort your friend, help her find a safe place, hold the leaders accountable. She needs to see that in action first, and you can worry about the theology down the road a little bit. And so it's going to take a lot of razor sharp discernment and wisdom to walk with people who actually think you're the toxic and unhealthy one. And that can be very difficult. But if you can maintain the relationship and then further down the road, maybe ask some good questions and establish that trust, that would be a great place to start.
Yeah. Yeah. So you had these 4 steps: first to pray, and then to stay calm and stay in their lives, do that triage, ask those good questions. And people can get the book to check out the rest about how to set boundaries. And you have some really good advice in the book. Tim, you had a really encouraging story to tell about your grandpa, and I thought we would give people a little bit of encouragement here at the end of the show. Can you tell us that story?
Sure. And this hopefully will leave with a hopeful message, because you can hear a lot about what we've been saying. And if you hop on the hashtag deconstruction, you'll see, man, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of hope. Like everything's going wrong. But what we found is there is actually hope. And that's why we shared that story in the book of my grandfather, who for most of his life was actually hostile to the gospel. He did not want to hear about religion or Christianity. And so whenever it came up, it was like, no, we're not talking about that. His religion was hockey, and, it was the Toronto Maple Leafs, that kind of thing. And he ended up I got a phone call one morning from my mom saying, your grandpa's in the hospital and it doesn't look good. Now, I had to fly out the next day to go to a youth apologetics conference. So it was like, okay, we're going to make an effort to be at the hospital. Picked up our kids, went to the hospital. But man, my whole family was there. We were all waiting to see my grandpa, but they were doing some tests on him, and they said it was going to be a couple hours. So we ended up taking our girls home. And I was determined to see my grandpa, because I didn't know what was going to happen. And so I picked up my sister from her house, and we went back to the hospital. When I got there, to my surprise, my whole family, there's like 30 of us kind of who were waiting to see my grandpa. They were all gone. They actually had left to go for dinner. So I went to talk to the nurse to find out what room my grandpa was in. They said, sorry, you can't go in. There was a tuberculosis kind of scare, and they thought he had it, and you can't go in without, with all the right equipment, so you can't go. And this was before COVID, before masks and shields and, all that stuff. And I said, I'm going in whether you like it or not, go call security. So they said, fine. They put all the stuff on us. We went in. And it was the most beautiful, talk about God answering prayers. Because that morning I had prayed, God, give me the courage and the boldness in front of all my family. Because I figured we'd all be in the same room together to proclaim the gospel to my grandpa one last time. And most of my family isn't saved on that side of the family. So it was going to be like one of these things where I'd have to work up the courage. Well, it turns out I have about 2 hours alone in the room, me and my sister, with my grandpa to talk about life and the afterlife and the gospel. And by God's grace, he gave his life in that moment to Christ. And again, I couldn't even believe it myself. It was one of those moments where I'm like, okay, are you sure you understood what we were just talking about? And he's like, yeah, Tim, I get it. And even as I'm praying, I'm like, reiterating, because it was so unbelievable. I thought there's no way this person is going. It was like, a lot of my own family had pretty much, given up. Like it's not going to happen. Well, I'm on the plane the next morning, and I get a text from my mom saying, your grandpa passed away in the night. So, I mean, if there's hope for my grandpa, there's hope for your situation. It may seem really bleak. It may seem like, no, this person is too far from the Lord. They don't want anything to do with Christ. Hold out hope. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. For my grandpa, it was like literally on his deathbed, where he submitted his life to Christ and repented of his sins. And I believe that I'll see him again in paradise. And so let that be an encouragement to those who are out there who have a loved one who seems far from the Lord. It may not, it may not be like that where I preach the gospel and okay, I'm in. It may be years down the road, but don't give up hope. If it can happen for, my grandpa, then it could happen for your life too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Tim. Thanks for being on the show, Tim.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Alisa, for being on the show as well.
Oh, it was great to be with you. Thanks for the great questions.
Oh, you're welcome. It was a great read. Please check out their book if you're watching or listening, The Deconstruction of Christianity. We'll drop a link in the show notes and in the YouTube description. Also, check out Alisa's YouTube channel and Tim's YouTube channel. We'll put links in the description as well. If you like this episode, please do give us a thumbs up on the video, drop a comment, and we'd love to interact with you in the comments. Please also rate our podcast on Spotify and rate us on Apple Podcasts as well. It really does help people find out more about what we're doing here on the Apologetics Guy Show. I'm your Apologetics Guy, Dr. McDowell, and until next time, keep the faith.